The meeting room had too much light. You could see the specks of dust in the air, catching on the smug, sterile smile of the new COO as he leaned back in the executive chair he hadn't earned. "We're consolidating vendors," he said casually, tapping a capped pen against the edge of my printed contract summary. "You're just an expensive go-between." Laughter, thin, polite, nervous, like the kind you hear at a funeral where no one liked the deceased. My throat went dry, not from fear, from restraint. They didn't understand what I did. They didn't care. Not about the 5-year relationship arc behind each vendor deal, not about the phased terms, not about the language I'd spent nights tightening like a noose around risk. They thought the spreadsheets told the whole story, that the numbers floated in their pristine rows by themselves, unbothered by human factors. But every dollar in procurement sat on top of a conversation, and I'd had all of them. Please take a second to subscribe and like the video. It really helps the team keep bringing stories like this to life, and over 97% of listeners forget to do it. Thank you. I glanced across the room. Melissa, the junior analyst I'd trained, was staring down at her tablet. She wouldn't look at me. Not since last week when she asked, "Will he cut your role?" And I'd simply said, yes. And now here we were. My title was still warm on the org chart, but the new COO had already made his point. Procurement would be centralized, automated, streamlined, as he called it. No more hand-holding, no more nuanced negotiating, no more me. What they didn't know, what no one in that room even thought to ask, was that I'd spent the last 8 years quietly building a procurement architecture with built-in protections. Not for me, for the company. But they'd thrown out the key, unaware that every contract had a quiet clause triggered by the very event happening right now. I kept my face blank. Let the silence settle like dust over the polished table. In my briefcase was a folder. It was slim, cream-colored, unassuming. The tab read, "Renegotiation clauses active." The COO didn't notice it. He was too busy nodding to himself, pleased with his disruption. I stood when the meeting adjourned, shook no hands, and walked out slowly. Nobody asked me what was in the folder. They would. It was raining the next morning, which felt both cliché and deserved. Not the dramatic kind of rain that slams against windows, but the soft, cold drizzle that gets under your skin before you even realize you're wet. HR had scheduled me for an 8:15 meeting. The kind of appointment slot that screams finality. When I stepped into the small, glass-walled room, the box was already waiting. Corrugated, empty, open. Strategic streamlining, they called it. That phrase was printed in bold Helvetica at the top of the exit letter, as if font weight could anchor their spin in truth. I scanned the first paragraph without really reading it. I'd seen enough of these before, just never with my name on them. Across the table sat Jenna from HR, the one who used to ask me how to expense vendor dinners. Now she wouldn't meet my eyes. She passed the envelope over like it was radioactive. "The severance is standard. You'll keep health through end of month, plus outplacement support. If you'd like to review..." "I've read it." My voice came out steadier than I expected. I took the pen, flipped to the final page, and signed. At that moment, the door creaked open, and he walked in. The COO, no title plate, no introduction, he just inserted himself into the moment, like he'd planned it for the drama. "Just wanted to say goodbye personally," he said, flashing that management consultant grin. "No hard feelings, right?" I looked at him, not smiling, not blinking. Then I pulled a second sheet from my purse, a one-liner I'd printed in advance, and stapled it right on top of the signed documents. His brow furrowed slightly, the smile held. The clause I'd written 2 years ago, buried in the legalese of every vendor MSA, now stood center stage. Per paragraph 6B, all contracts are subject to immediate renegotiation upon change of account manager. He didn't flinch, not in front of HR, but I watched the moment his pupils contracted. A quick recalculation. He knew he hadn't read the fine print. He knew the rate guarantees they'd relied on for Q3 forecasts were now floating, unanchored. And worse, they'd be renegotiated not by me, the known quantity, but by someone with no history, no leverage, no trust. I packed the box slowly. A coffee mug, my notepad with the soft leather cover, a printed map of supplier regions, no photos, no awards, no farewell notes. Just the weight of what they'd lost without knowing it yet. As I reached the elevator, he stood watching from the hallway, hands in his pockets, smile tighter now. Maybe he was thinking about freight rates, or telecom bundling thresholds, or what would happen when vendor number 12 realized I was gone. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't look back. The box sat unopened by the door. I didn't need what was in it yet. Not the mug, not the planner, not the printed map of distribution zones. What I needed was already waiting upstairs, behind a login screen the COO had never asked about, and likely never knew existed. I powered on the laptop I hadn't turned off in years. No startup chime, no bright splash screen, just a clean terminal prompt and a familiar password field. Two-factor auth pinged my phone. Then I was in. The vendor liaison dashboard greeted me like an old friend. Clean, quiet, secure. On the left pane, 26 master service agreements, status lights all green. On the right, contract summaries, handshake memos, and internal relationship notes tagged with dates, initials, and soft warning thresholds I'd built over time. I clicked into the first MSA. Vendor No. 1, reassignment triggered. A soft pop-up asked me to confirm. I clicked yes. Vendor number 2, same thing. Then number 3, then number 4. Each toggle meant the same thing. The terms we'd locked in, some after months of flying out to factories, warehouse floors, trade expos, late dinners in terrible hotels, were now up for review. Not by force, not out of malice, just by clause. Paragraph 6b, standard but dormant, until now. The notifications weren't dramatic. No flashing red banners, just elegantly written emails delivered through secure channels addressed to the right people. Dear Jordan, thank you for your continued partnership over the past 5 years. With recent transitions in account management, our agreement terms are now subject to standard renegotiation protocols. We invite you to re-engage on rate discussions at your earliest convenience. Please feel free to use the original review templates. Warm regards. I sent 20 of them, each personalized, each close with a line that mattered more than they realized. As always, I remain available to support a smooth transition, personally. That was the part they'd respond to, not the clause, not the rates. Me. They remembered who pushed for their payment schedules when finance delayed, who defended their fuel surcharges when everyone else called them greedy, who returned their calls at midnight when port delays tanked their quarterly bonus. They didn't work for my former company. They worked with me. I copied no one at corporate, didn't CC the new purchasing lead, didn't BCC the COO. I didn't need to. By the time the emails landed in inboxes across North America and parts of the EU, I'd already moved on to drafting version 2 of my consultancy website, not to replace what they'd taken, but to greet what they'd just given away. 3 days passed in silence. Not for me. My inbox was already filling with polite replies, calendar invites, a few messages that started with, "Can't believe they let you go," before pivoting into rate reevaluation timelines and logistics notes. But from them, from the company that had shown me the door, not a word. They hadn't noticed yet. Or, if they had, they hadn't understood what they were seeing. That was fine. This part wasn't for them. At 10:47 a.m. on a quiet Thursday, I composed one last message. I addressed it not to individuals, but to a curated group list I'd maintained quietly for years. Procurement contacts, executive tier, no emotional language, no farewell. Just a professional broadcast template attached as a courtesy. The subject line read, "New account manager assigned, rates up for review." Beneath it, I included suggested phrases. Soft, diplomatic, precise, just enough to imply continuity while asserting change. As discussed with your former director, in light of recent structural changes, with appreciation for past collaboration, we look forward to revisiting our agreement under the updated framework. There was no mention of me, no logo, no header, just clean formatting, consistent tone, and phrasing that would resonate with executives who'd played this game before. Because that's the thing. I didn't need to ask anyone to raise rates. I just needed to remind them that they could. Most of them hadn't looked at those contracts since the day they signed them. But I knew the language, I knew the pressure points, energy index tie-ins, delivery penalties, fulfillment windows. I knew which partners had been waiting for a reason to realign their margins, and I knew exactly how they liked to be cued. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even personal. This was process. All legally triggered, all procedurally polite. I closed the email with one line. Please feel free to adapt language as needed. As always, I trust your professionalism in these matters. Then I hit send, sat back, and watched the echo move outward across supplier networks, internal routing systems, contract desks, finance teams. The company had called me a middleman. They'd never understood the power of what passed through the middle until it moved without them. By Monday morning, the surface tension broke. It started quietly, a flagged message in the procurement inbox, then another in finance. By 9:00 a.m., it had escalated to 4 unread emails marked urgent, rate adjustment confirmation. By noon, the purchasing team had stopped pretending it was manageable. Vendor number 7 sent over their revised freight table, a 3x multiplier on all Tier 2 distribution lanes, citing revised baseline calculations per current agreement terms. No apology. Just a polite reminder that the new contact should already have the updated clause on file. Vendor number 12 added peak hour penalties across all time-sensitive fulfillment windows. It wasn't even aggressive, just surgical. A $10 increase here, a $20 nudge there, all wrapped in formal language and mutual appreciation. Vendor number 3 suspended their courtesy priority queue, the one we'd built quietly over years of last-minute favors and glass of wine agreements after trade shows. Gone. Pending new relationship stabilization, they wrote, we look forward to re-establishing trust with your new leadership. Every email was perfectly polite, and every one of them began with the same phrase, as discussed with your former director. The COO noticed. Of course he did. He wasn't dumb, just arrogant. He pinged his new head of procurement mid-morning, CCing finance and legal. Is this real? Where's this language coming from? Why are they invoking prior discussions with someone who no longer works here? Silence. Then a tentative reply from his analyst. We're looking into the origin of these renegotiation triggers. It appears they're tied to change of contact clauses, but we're still digging. He pushed back. Did anyone know about this clause, 6B? Was it in the contract review process? More silence. Because they hadn't done a full review, they'd trusted the dashboard, the database, the high-level summaries. But I'd built those contracts line by line with legal sign-off and vendor cooperation, and every single one carried the same hairline fracture. Unnoticeable until pressure was applied. They assumed supplier relationships were static, mechanical, interchangeable. They thought relationship meant CRM entries and batch emails. But these weren't just vendors. These were people. People who remembered who stood by them when their budgets were cut, who walked their warehouses during storm seasons, who approved overages without waiting for formal memos. And now those same people were professionally, calmly moving their margins, not out of spite, just business. The COO leaned back in his chair and scanned the email thread growing like a vine. Then he asked the only question left. Who has the original copies of the MSAs? No one replied, because the only person who ever kept the originals, annotated, current, and quietly fireproofed had been walked out last Thursday, with a box and a clause. By Wednesday, the numbers started bleeding red. Finance escalated a report flagged for unusual variance. The week-over-week procurement spend had spiked by 14%. That wasn't a ripple. That was a rupture. And it wasn't spread out neatly across accounts. It hit hardest in logistics, packaging, and specialty fulfillment, the very sectors I used to stabilize with handshake deals and subtle deferrals. The CFO pinged the COO before noon. Need clarification on procurement surge. Forecast assumptions no longer align. The COO brushed it off at the next leadership sync, called it temporary volatility, blamed it on external factors, on market noise, on anything but the precise moment he fired the one person holding the threads together. But volatility doesn't send cancellation notices. That afternoon, vendor number 4 froze preferred status, citing pause in continuity until terms were fully reevaluated. That meant no expedited routing, no guaranteed ship windows, no auto-allocation on constrained goods. Vendor number 11 followed suit. Their note was brief. Pending updated commercial terms, we're reverting to default client classification. We appreciate your understanding. Then came the gut punch. Vendor number 9, the specialized supplier we built an entire quarter's go-to-market plan around, simply withdrew. Not renegotiated, not restructured, withdrew. The email was cold, clean, and final. In light of a lapse in operational continuity, we are discontinuing active support. We wish you the best in securing alternate partners. I stared at the forwarded copy that a former colleague sent me, off the record. The timestamp was 4:22 p.m. The subject line, termination of service, immediate. That wasn't volatility. That was abandonment. And the irony was sharp enough to taste. The COO had cut my role because he believed I was a bottleneck, a layer, a middle person slowing down scalable efficiency. But what he didn't realize is that scalable efficiency only exists once trust is already in place. The contracts were never the glue, I was. And now, the real cost wasn't the money, it was the scramble. Because every one of those vendor agreements had been built over months, sometimes years. You don't replace that with a click. You can't plug in new partners and expect them to inherit familiarity, urgency, goodwill. There were no grandfather clauses, no extensions, no soft landings. The legal team confirmed it. With the change in account owner, every prior agreement reverted to default negotiation status. Lead times doubled. Freight lanes collapsed. Packaging minimums returned to full load thresholds. Payment terms went from net 60 to net 15. The entire supply chain rebuilt from scratch. They had deleted the position, but what they'd actually deleted was a memory structure, and now they were paying for forgetting. Thursday morning, the message arrived without ceremony. No subject line in all caps. No official letterhead. Just a plain email sent from an address I recognized. One of the mid-tier managers who used to sit 2 rows down from me and always asked for help wording vendor replies. Hope you're well. It began like we were old friends and not the company's latest liability. Leadership's wondering if you'd consider coming back as a consultant. Temporary, of course, just to help stabilize a few accounts. I read it once. Then again. Not because I was surprised. I'd been expecting it. What surprised me was how long it had taken. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I opened the folder on my desktop labeled Contingency Consulting Onboarding. Inside it, a slide deck I'd prepared the week after they fired me, not out of arrogance and out of experience. The title slide was simple: Supply Restabilization, Independent Review Terms. I attached it to my reply with no extra commentary, just the deck, just the terms. Page 1, non-exclusive support. I wouldn't be theirs. I'd be independent, neutral, transactional. Page 2, flat daily rates tiered by scope. No discounts, no hourly padding, just math. Page 3, a required retainer, payable upfront. No net terms, no approval cycles. If they wanted my time, they'd buy it like everyone else. And then the condition, bold, centered, non-negotiable. I will speak directly with vendors, not internal staff, no exceptions. That clause wasn't about control. It was about speed, about clarity, about not wasting time retraining people who still didn't understand what they'd broken. The final page listed my updated contact sheets, one for each vendor, mapped by category and urgency. Every single line began the same way. Trusted relationship, established by my name. I didn't need to explain the rest. They knew who had built those lines. They also knew they couldn't replace them. 5 hours later, the reply came from a different address. This time, a senior procurement director. Short, formal. We've reviewed your proposal. Leadership is prepared to engage under your stated terms. Please send banking details for retainer transfer. I closed the laptop. They'd erased my role. But now they were renting the space it used to fill, at market rate with zero leverage. The freeze didn't arrive with noise, it arrived with silence. By Friday, the board had scheduled an unscheduled meeting, not a full quarterly, not a soft sync, a tense, camera on, voices tight emergency call. Margins were off. Q4 projections had slumped off their clean slide decks, and the investor update scheduled for next week had already been rescheduled twice, not because of logistics, but because no one knew what to say. The COO showed up with a new pitch deck, a polished, over-designed thing labeled Procurement Recovery Roadmap, bullet points in navy blue, centralized procurement, streamlined communications, tech-enabled pipeline visibility, but vendors weren't answering him anymore. He could click resend all he wanted. They weren't ghosting. They were redirecting politely, professionally, to me. Some replied with, "Per your former director's prior arrangements, we're working through their consultancy for transition continuity." Others didn't bother explaining. They just looped me in and left him off. Because relationships don't transfer. Not with a title. Not with a process. Not with a corporate memo. And certainly not with a man who once called me a middleman to my face in front of a room full of people. That week, 7 vendors signed fresh, long-term contracts. But not with the company. With me. My consultancy, which had launched quietly, with no fanfare, no PR, just a simple black and white site and an inbox with a custom domain, had become their preferred point of contact. Not because I asked, because I remembered who they were, their kids' names, their late shipment penalties, their slow-loading procurement portals and regional pain points, and because I never once pretended they were interchangeable. Now, those same vendors were anchoring their quarter with my firm. The COO never saw the signatures, never saw the rates, never saw the quiet alignment forming around him. He still thought he was presenting a plan. But the board wasn't looking at his slides. They were looking at the pipeline freeze and wondering who was holding the heat. The annual shareholder letter arrived in the usual glossy envelope. White, weighty, designed to impress by texture alone. I didn't request a copy, but someone forwarded it to me, not from inside, not anymore, from the outside, like a quiet nod passed across a crowded room. Appendix B, page 13, buried between currency fluctuation notes and a 3-line comment about overseas logistics capacity, was a sentence that had likely been debated for hours in legal review. Significant Q3 cost increases due to vendor term changes under renegotiation. That was all. No names, no detail, just enough to explain a missing margin and pacify curious shareholders. But I didn't need to be named. My name had already traveled, not on billboards or banners, but in the footnotes of decks passed between procurement heads, in late-night Slack messages between analysts wondering how things unraveled so fast, in vendor CRM logs that quietly marked me as the point where things worked. At a supply chain summit 2 months later, someone sent me a photo of a slide. It read, "Centralized systems versus relational memory, the cost of overriding trust." Beneath it, in fine print, "Case data courtesy of M. Layton, original vendor liaison architecture." They didn't know I was sitting in the back row of that very seminar, hoodie on, quiet, watching the case study unfold without dramatics. Just clean facts, clean numbers, clean consequences. They never meant for me to see it. I saw everything. The COO, he's still there, for now. Tighter jaw, less confidence. Rumors of a Q1 performance review swirl like winter air. The vendors? They're fine. Anchored, stable, and my consultancy's booked through next quarter. I never raised my voice, never retaliated, never leaked a thing. I just moved. And when the middle moves, the balance goes with it. He called me a middleman. The middle moved, and the whole thing collapsed.